Our next speaker really needs no introduction. He's been a friend of the symposium for many years. He's presented here many times. He's written many books about canoeing and canoeists, and most of us have read at least some of his books, such as Deep Waters, The Lake Temiskaming Tragedy, Fire in the Bones, about the life and times of Bill Mason, and he published The Lure of Faraway Places, the writings of Herb Pohl, a very stalwart WCA member and a former chair of the Wilderness Canoe Association. His newest work is Circling the Midnight Sun, traveling around the globe along the Arctic Circle. If you want to know more about James Raffan, all you have to do is Google his name, and you'll find out things about him from conception to the present. So it was too much to talk about. So without further ado, James Raffan.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone. I feel like I'm a faker breathing the same air as you when it comes to canoes. I'm delighted to be here for a number of reasons. Just to be amongst friends in a constellation, in a soup of stories that just doesn't happen anywhere else. I am conscious coming here that we've lost a couple of stalwart members, or at least John Lentz has been here for many, many years. I think John Lentz, George, and Linda was there in 1986 when this gathering began. But I don't know if you knew Eric Pelly, David Pelly's son, who was in his 20th year, died suddenly last day of last year. I'm very conscious of the fact that there's a kind of a continuum that's part of this symposium that goes on, and I think that's one of the marks, George, of a strong thing that's been created here. And we can mark the passing of participants just like we can mark the addition of new people like Chief Mizell Joe and his story, his remarkable story of Newfoundland. I wanted to say that one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here tonight is it represents a new combination of organizations. Mizell Joe, Saginaw Joe is here tonight as a result of a combination of efforts from the Wilderness Canoe Symposium, the Canadian Canoe Museum, and Adventure Canada. And that, just by way of explanation, I wanted to say that the Canadian Canoe Museum has been the beneficiary of kindness and energy from the Wilderness Canoe Symposium over the years. And we're actually actively in the process of rethinking who we are and what we do. If you imagine the museum as kind of a glass case into which canoes, famous canoes, significant canoes, are transported from the hinterland, that's a pretty conventional model of the museum. And in fact, the museum has an incredible collection of canoes, an incredible portrait of Canada and 600 odd canoes. But as we've been thinking about what it means to be a museum, we've asked ourselves, what would happen if we put an arrow on the other end of those vectors that sort of mark the track of canoes coming to the museum and started talking to those communities again? And what would happen if we fattened that up a little bit digitally and actually made a way of communicating with some of the communities from which our canoes have come? And actually, why don't we actually start thinking about what else is going on with canoes around the country? We've got Indigenous communities, we've got municipalities, we've got clubs and organizations, we've got paddling clubs, we've got kindred not-for-profit organizations, schools, and school districts. And what's been going on at the Canadian Canoe Museum, you may have heard we're thinking about moving to the water. What a concept, a boat museum on the water. But we've also been thinking probably as hard about what it might mean to reinvent ourselves as opposed to just relocating ourselves. And so what we've been doing is thinking about actually widening the case, if you like, to include communications between and amongst organizations. And this partnership with Adventure Canada and the Wilderness Canoe Symposium and with the Wilderness Canoe Association, we are very excited about that, because with the digital resources that are at our disposal now, we can actually think in fairly realistic terms about connecting to Conn River, Newfoundland, and the crazy, amazing, wonderful stuff that's going on there with canoes, so that somebody might be able to walk into the Canoe Museum to a screen and there'd be a live feed from a canoe building shed in Conn River. And likewise, in Conn River, maybe there's some way to walk into that kind of organization and connect to this amazing collection of canoes in Peterborough and elsewhere. And in fact, Ms. Joe is here now. He's coming to the Canadian Canoe Museum to deliver the Whipper Lecture on Tuesday. But I do want to say that we are very excited about the possibilities that this new sort of concept of museum represent. And I want to come back to that at the end of my talk, because what we're thinking about is actually creating a vibrant canoe culture into which other people can enter, but that has fundamentally changed how we're thinking about what we do. I think we have been in the museum building business. I think we should be in the nation building business, or maybe even in the nation rebuilding business, to bring the stories from the places where canoeing is as alive today as it has ever been to the collection where some of the other stories from the past, because canoes tell us about who we are and how we got to where we are, but I think they also have lessons that can take us all forward. And I want to just say it's been amazing to listen to Sagamo Joe's conversations, but it's also amazing to be here, because I think there is the possibility in the connections between the WCA, the WCS, and us to keep going. I think there's a lot going on. I want to come back to that. But before I do anything else, I want to say there's a guy in this room who has been a great supporter of the Canadian Canoe Museum over the years, and we have a very limited number of very snappy lids that have the logo on the front that we all know, but on the back it says, George, patron of the Canadian Canoe Museum, and I just want to give you this, because you've earned it, buddy. Gee, the midnight sun, as billed. Last time I was here, I talked about paddling down the Coppermine River with a group of Inuit young people from Galuktuk, the 2010 Tenerife expedition. That was actually the start of this round-the-world journey that I took, and I want to just tell you a couple of stories from this, because I think they come back to the idea of where we are in history now and the kinds of things that we need to do. The idea for going around the world actually came from my book about George Simpson, but it didn't seem like that difficult a thing to do, to travel around the world at the Arctic Circle, meet the neighbors. It's only 17,662 kilometers. You just head north and turn right. Keep going. I thought it would take 2 years. It took 5 to do that. And I guess the motivation behind this is really quite simple. Many people are looking north now as a result of climate change. And for many of us, the images that come back from television and the media and other sources of information are polar bears, and none more sort of graphically and dramatically as this famous 28 seconds of video from St. Alan of Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, which showed this poor bear swimming around in a warming ocean looking for a place to land. And I started life as a marine biologist way back at the University of Guelph studying polar bear vision, but after a while there I decided that wasn't really a very good place for me to be, and if I was going to do anything else with bears, I would do it in the wild. And I ended up sort of falling in love with the people who showed me the bears, and that's where my career has gone. But when I see Coca-Cola telling us that buy a Coke helps, global warming, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That same product also causes tooth decay, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, all sorts of other things, particularly, in us all, but particularly in the north. But the worry, quite simply, was that the north, as we all look there, it has the face of a bear for many people, but it also has a human face. And the purpose of my project, and it actually did involve canoes a couple of places along the way, was to simply meet the people who live in the north, to ask them about change, climate change, and whatever they're feeling. And there are a lot of people at or above the Arctic Circle, 4 million of them, 500,000 of whom are indigenous. Most of them are in the half of the Arctic that is Russian, 8 different language groups. But they're there, and that was the project, to simply get myself around the world, following as much as possible the Arctic Circle. It involved visas, it involved boats, it involved the kindness of many, many people along the way. And to take you around there in a kind of a talk like this, we'd probably be here till 6 in the morning, but I wanted to pick a couple of examples of the kinds of things I found out, because I think we're at a point in history where there are voices in the north that we don't often hear. Some of us have heard perhaps at the end of canoe trips, but voices that have wisdom, that have things to say that we should listen to. But the kinds of people, it ranged from the point of view, although I started on the Coppermine River in 2010, I had to move sort of episodically. So the book itself actually starts in Iceland and goes toward the rising sun around this way. But the variety of types of people, and it was just a hit or a miss. Sometimes I did pre-connection and sometimes not. Suava Gilfison fishes 365 days a year in Iceland. If you ask him about climate change, he'd say, "What? Have you noticed anything different, Suava?" Well, there are probably more fish and they're maybe bigger where we are. This is why you should be careful with online rental agreements. The Nanette people of this area of just east of the Urals are still very much nomadic reindeer herders, and I've got some stories about them. That guy tried to sell me Amway. I'm actually going to tell you about this chap who's a medical doctor and a shaman. And anyway, it's a diversity of people, but of all the things I've met, can we get some audio on the board? I've met a lot of different people in the Canadian Arctic, but I've met 0 ballerinas. And this is actually the second-year ballet class at the School for the Arts in Salahard, which is right on the Arctic Circle, right there. And they were just welcoming a neighbor from across the pole. How are we doing on the tech here, Roger? Is it in the right hole? I don't even want to touch that line. Isn't that what the actress said to the bishop, Roger? Sorry about that. This being a sort of a geographic exercise at some level, there's no sound coming out now, so we'll maybe catch it next time around. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the diversity. So if you go to Suave Gylfason's place in Grimsey, which is the only place in Iceland where the Arctic Circle touches Iceland, on a blisteringly hot day in July, it's about 6 degrees. And on a freezing cold day in January, it's -3. You need one set of clothes. As you move east, that is Mo i Rana in Norway, over here. You notice that you're still getting a current effect, but it's the minus, I think this is 10, so that's probably -5 in January, and maybe +10 or so. But you can see that the further you move across into Russia, you get more extreme temperatures, particularly in the winter. The one I want to show you is this one, Oymyakon, the Pole of Cold, which is along the Road of Bones in the Sakha Republic over here. Last January, the average temperature was -58.7 or something like that. It's the coldest place on Earth outside Antarctica. But as you keep going over towards Sarah Palin's house here, it starts to come up. And in fact, in the most aptly or unfortunately mnemonic airport in the world, FU, Fort Yukon, you actually get the peaks of temperature because they're, for some reason, the combination of mountains and continental effects and the currents that are there. But that gives you an idea. So that's what the travels around the Arctic Circle look like when you're actually thinking about it. The summer temperatures are all sort of in that range of kind of balmy that we've all felt in our canoes, but it's in the winter when the temperatures get really most... The one point I wanted to make, though, and this is, I really hope the audio's working, was that what I thought Northerners would tell me was never what I thought they would say. Very often didn't have much bearing at all on what they actually said. There's no audio coming just yet, but there will be in a sec. What Northerners said and what I expected they would say was often at odds. And never more so than, this was just before Christmas this year because it's such a wonderful example. I was in Tromsø at a youth rally, and there's a little polar museum at 70 degrees north. And I thought, oh, I'll go in there and just see. It's a little shanty house on the shore in Tromsø. And they were advertising a new exhibit they had that compared the polar heroes to the cowboy. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. I've never actually seen the word heterosexual in a museum interpretive panel before. And I've also never seen Fridtjof Nansen. I put that in there for seasonally adjusting his bits that were staring me in the face. So I'm thinking this is a pretty ordinary museum, but I was just starting to get an inkling of, but the cowboy, you were the polar hero, independence, adventure, wanderlust. It was making sense to me, but I realized that just out of the right of my vision, there was a television monitor that appeared to be playing sort of John Wayne-y kind of movies. This is when the audio's coming through, guys. All of a sudden, though, something wasn't right, because as I started to pay attention to what was going on the television monitor, these were not heterosexual cowboys. For those of you who haven't seen Ang Lee's amazing movie, Brokeback Mountain, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, I don't think this exhibit is going where I think it's going. And sure enough, the next panel was a sketch from Fridtjof Nansen's journal. And it actually is talking about the feminine motif in the masculine world. And it points out here that of the 5 fictional accounts of Nansen's journey, which included a winter in extremis with a colleague, Johansen, where they had to winter together under very difficult conditions, a bit like Hornby and Critchell Bullock, only without the cave. Anyway, this panel points out that 3 of the 5 fictional accounts of Nansen's and Johansen's winter together include a homoerotic relationship between these 2 guys. Well, of course, it's the 2000s and whatever, if it was 14. I tweeted as much from that museum, and I said, is it impossible to imagine 2 men sharing a sleeping bag without erotic undertones? New take on Fridtjof Nansen from the Polar Museum. And of course, immediately following that, a friend of mine from the British Antarctic Survey put a quote in from another book that actually just... let me tell you that this museum has a take on Arctic exploration that you will never find in Canada. Talking about fusty breath and I'm not even going to go there. Your back feels like my wife's and a few other things. That simply to make the point that I was surprised in a lot of places by what people had to say. Going around the circle involved many, many different conveyances, from nuclear-powered icebreakers to walking, to dog sleds, planes. That's the ice of the Lena River, the ice road on the Lena River. Trekol, French motor, Russian chassis. I asked Oleg here, the fisherman who owned that truck, whether it was a happy marriage between the French motor and the Russian chassis. He didn't get the question. He told me later, though, that he gets tired of coming home smelling like beer and smoke rather than smelling like women, if you get the general drift of that conversation. The point that came through again and again and again as I went around the Arctic Circle, I would ask about climate change. People would say, oh yeah, we notice that there are bugs in the kitchen that we've never seen before. We notice that there are birds here that weren't here before. We notice that there are birds that were here that are gone now. We notice the ice is not present where it used to be present. We notice in some places where we used to camp, the Lapland rhododendrons and the willows and the birches, dwarf birches, are so high now that we can't actually see our kids when they run, and we worry about bears. Visibility is an issue. So everybody has stories about climate change and about things they're noticing, but the stories that come back is that they say, well, that's, if you say, is that the most important thing in your life? And they would say, well, no. What's most important to us is burying the promise of the future in 15-year-olds who are taking their lives at unprecedented rates. What's really bothering us is the changes that are occurring when we're burying elders who are taking with them the last syllables of language that is nuanced to the land, to the landscape, and again and again and again around the Arctic Circle, that's what I heard. That's what people talk to me about being important. And notions of truth were tested again and again and again. Received truths that we carry with us, truths that we think we hold as a result of book learning, truths that really involve a set of blinders with cameras and our enlightened approach to learning the words that we use, the kind of conventions that we have to cast what it is that we hold dear. And these truths were quite often tested by people, and you may have encountered this, different ways of knowing. I mean, the canoe trip we've just heard described, Chief Joe was talking about how there seemed to be another controller on the Spirit Wind boat and on the whole project. Well, I want to just take you into a circumstance that really opened my eyes to some other ways of knowing. This guy's name is Maxime Duran. He's 37 years old, and as I said at the beginning, he's a medical doctor. But his great-grandfather was a shaman who was given the choice by the Stalinists, or I guess it might be the Bolsheviks, to either break his drum in front of them or suffer the consequences, which was death by firing squad. And he chose the consequences. His mother was a healer as well, but chose to configure her powers as a shaman in medical terms. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, though, he has come out as a shaman, as it were, and actually goes to shamanic contests at local fairs to see who can out-shaman the next one. So I'm having the person who's taking this picture is a little sprite of a guy, a little Saha man called Ruslan Skribikin, who was the interpreter I was traveling with at the time. This is now north and east of Mongolia in the Saha Republic. And Ruslan had, and this chap here, Vyacheslav Sredrin, who is the chief of the Yukagir in that area, has brought me to Maxime so that I can learn what the shaman might have to say about change and about the world. And I'm ending up having this academic discussion with him about what he does. I'm asking him these inane questions about levels of the soul and, all these kind of things that he does that have to do with spirits moving in the darkness and that kind of thing. This is driving my little interpreter, Ruslan, insane. And finally he looks at me and says, "James, shut up." And he turned to Maxime and went, blah, 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 blah. And basically what he said to him is, you need to show this guy what you can do, really. You need to read his aura. And Maxime said, "Oh no, look, I got a wedding to do here and I got to get going later." And somehow Ruslan convinced him that he needed to read my aura. So what he did, he asked me to stand, and he lit up a smudge and kind of cruised around me. This little stick, whose name I forget, has a hole in the end, and he looks through the smoke, through the hole in the end of this thing. The literal translation of shaman in Saha language is the man who takes things from the air. So he's running around me. Sometimes my eyes are closed, sometimes they're open, but I see him grabbing stuff out of the air and kind of looking between his fingers like this. And eventually, after about 10 minutes of that, we all go and sit down at this table where he's been describing this choron, which is carved in a lot of teachings associated with that device for drinking fermented mare's milk. And we all sit at the table, and Ruslan is just about to explode. This little interpreter, so he leans over the table and says, "So, what did you see?" And Maxime looked at him completely droll and flat and said, "Nothing, he's closed." And I thought, oh, well, son of a tight-assed Yorkshireman and a Scottish midwife, we don't do emotion well in our family. That was a fine answer for me. And Ruslan, he just couldn't accept that. He said, "Oh, come on, you must have seen something." And at that point, Maxime, on the table, draws a line. And he said, "Well, I see a line with some dots on it like that, and I see another line like that, and I see a curvy line." And I didn't know if he was drawing a horse or what he was doing. And just as this image crystallized in my head, he said, "Do you live here?" And what he had done, on the other side of the planet, as far as I know without Google Earth or any other aid, he had drawn a detailed map of Sealy's Bay, Ontario, Cranberry Lake, Haskins Point Road, the main street. It's Russell Thompson's house, and indeed, that's my house. What? So here's me thinking I've kind of got the corner on truth. I've got a bunch of different pieces of paper that said I'm an uneducated guy. I had known nothing about this. How is that possible? What am I missing? But to bring this to a rather finer point, I'm sorry you can't see. This is Valentina Sovkina, who's the head of the Sami in the northwestern part of Russia. Those are her beautiful hands. In most instances, through the kindness of people, they would welcome you and give you a bed and feed you as a neighbor. Whether they would trust you is another matter, and that was just beautiful when it happened and frustrating when it didn't. But in this instance, we've got a group of elders, Sami elders, who are in northwestern Russia near Murmansk, who we've had a conversation about change. And again, it was mostly about suicide and language decay and cultural issues and the demise of reindeer herding and a lot of the difficult things that are still associated with conquest. But Valentina, at the end of this encounter for an afternoon, we were in the van driving from Lvozoro, where this is, Love Lake, back to Murmansk. And she said, James, if you want to have an idea of what I feel in my heart about what's going on here, I want you to listen to this CD by Mari Boyne. And Mari Boyne is a Norwegian Sami singer. And she said, if you want to know what's in my heart, listen to this song called A Conversation with God.
Tog en låkehalm I slät I kom uitalivtje muine Manelena Jimin Turihka dikte soodin toela maat Mänä revu jolmus vuoda Mane soodet Ähtsämet Tu tahtu olla suhtet aina Käfis mä näin häjohosin Tahtoko nuu
That's what Valentina Sovkina has in her heart. Where do you fit into this? Where do we fit into this? You may know that the 8 circumpolar countries, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia, the United States, and Canada, and then, of course, Greenland with Denmark, who's the furthest along in the devolution of power. They can actually see a Greenlandic future. They're wondering, though, whether weaning themselves off allegiance to the Denmark crown and support and trading that for support from the Chinese is actually worth it. But that's what's in the works. But those 8 countries have come together to create the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council has, as part of its makeup, it wasn't a totally Canadian idea, but it was formed in the 90s, and Canada played a role there. But one of the key aspects of the Arctic Council is that there are Indigenous participants, permanent participants in the organization. And you can just see Sergei Kiriuchi, who's the head of RIPON, the Russian Indigenous group. Here's Minister Glukak, and this chap is head of the Sami, and there are representatives there. This was a meeting that was in May of 2011 in Nuuk, when the first legally binding agreement was actually put together by the Arctic Council, which has to do with air search and rescue in the Arctic. But one of the things about the Arctic Council is that they make decisions where possible by consensus instead of by vote. And that's a good thing. But not everybody agrees because of the resource potential of the Arctic. 30% of the undiscovered oil is there, huge amounts of iron, and then rare earth metals, platinoids, all sorts of resources. The North is battery, the North is larder, lives on in many sort of middle latitude frames of mind. And one of the people who is frustrated with the slowness of the Arctic Council in making decisions is a chap who, when asked what was Iceland doing after 2008 when its economy crashed, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, the president of Iceland, said, "Why, we're building a beautiful opera hall." That's Harpa, the opera hall. Grimsson, you may remember, when 3 Icelandic banks failed in 2008 and the Icelandic Alþingi, the parliament, voted. There were a lot of Europeans involved in the ice save crisis, but they lost a lot of money, and the Icelandic parliament opted or voted to pay them back, essentially, pay the governments back who had paid their own nationals back. Grimsson, as president, like our governor general, I suppose, has the ability to veto a bill, and he's the one who said, no, these banks need to fail. The currency came to half. He was put on the terrorist watch list by Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of England. But in the fullness of time, he's still there, and he decided that what the world really needed was not an Arctic Council that was being very slow in bringing in other interests, particularly China, Korea, Taiwan, India, other big producing countries. And so what he did is he said, I'm going to convene something called the Arctic Circle. And anybody can come, anybody can have a seat. And he had some heavy-hitting help to do that, among them Ban Ki-moon and big politicians, people from, Eric Schmidt from Google was there. They just had the second one of these. And it was an amazing event, insofar as people got together to sell the northern farm, and the people who lived there were not present. There were almost no indigenous people at the Arctic Circle meeting, and they had these maps, sometimes showing the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage, but they weren't just concepts. They were talking, I mean, then there were, the Chinese were there, the Japanese were there, and these are people, and they're talking about tonnage. They're talking about how this is going to work. They're showing graphs and diagrams about how to take oil out from underneath the ice and bring it up, and how to bring that. And terms like sustainable exploitation were being used with no irony. The message that was at that meeting, and we've just had a second one at Thanksgiving in Reykjavik, was that the North is open for business. And if you talk to any Northerner, they would all say, yeah, we are open for business, but we want to participate. Fate control, which is a metric of Arctic community health that is discussed in some length in Arctic community health documents, fate control, the extent to which you are in charge of your own destiny, is almost absent around the circumpolar world to one extent or another. And we have Nunavut, and that is an incredible step towards fate control. But you also look at Nunavut and you look at the participation rates in the actual corridors of power, and you realize that there's still a lot of the white settlers, as it were, who were involved there, and industry is also involved in a big way. That's a candle in the bottom corner, and I want to just finish by making a point that this is a famous compilation image of the world at night. And I think so often we think of what we are and the policies and the knowledge that we hold as light that we surround ourselves in. But if you look at the north, it's dark. And I think as we think about northern development, and I purposely left out slides of the finding of the Erebus, because although that is a fantastic find and really rejigs our sense of the North. You know, after 169 years, finding Franklin's ship is an amazing find, but to have it presented to the country by a prime minister who appears to be more interested in dead white explorers and 11 meters of water than he is in infant mortality rates that are off the charts, youth suicide rates. A young man between 17 and 24 in our country is between 10 and 70 times more likely than to take their life than a kid here. Food security is an issue, and why our government was doing that, but we think, I mean, we make our policies on the decks of those proverbial ships, but we think of our wisdom as light to take into the darkness. And I think it's high time we turned that whole notion upside down and figured out ways to let it out of the people, or help the people who are there bring that light into our world, because I think there's something to be gained substantially by us. And here's where I want to end. No, this is almost where I want to end. The conclusion I've come to, and you can read about this in my book, I'm pretty sure we are the bear. Swimming around in a warming soup of our own making, wondering where we're going to land. But what are we going to do about that? Well, you can buy my book. That would be a good start. And I haven't brought any here because I'd have to charge you $35. If you go to Amazon, they're $21.97. Figure that out. Where I want to end is to say Canada's got a birthday coming up on July 1st, 2017, and the Canadian Canoe Museum has been thinking a lot about what it's going to do for that. And as I've been thinking about what to do in the North, there are two organizations. One is called Inspire, and the other one's called Canadians for a New Partnership. Inspire is the work of Roberta Jameson, among others. She's an amazing Mohawk woman who's got an organization going that is actually devoted to Indigenous education in schools. Canadians for a New Partnership has broad base, but one of the main leaders is Paul Martin, and he's in there. Those are two organizations that you can get going. But an organization that formed last March that now involves nearly 4 million youth across Canada is called the 4Rs Youth Movement. And this is something that, 4 R's are reciprocity, respect, relevance, and reconciliation. We're looking at the Canadian Canoe Museum very intently at joining up with the 4 R's, which now involves Boys and Girls Clubs across the country, Assembly of First Nations, the YMYWCA, anyway, you can youth organizations across the country being led by youth with CEOs of those big organizations like the Y helping out. But my sense at this point is that with what I've learned in the North and what I've seen and what I've heard, just canoeing and visiting communities along the way, we've got a long way to go on these 4 R's particularly. And that if we can't move the agenda forward with respect to we love the wilderness, but we also love the people who know the wilderness best. The Indigenous people who live there, many of whom in our country don't have water, which is so ironic when we have a DART team that gets sent around the world to bring fresh water to the people of drought-stricken or earthquake or difficult areas, when in fact water is a huge issue in our place. If we don't get that agenda worked out a bit more further along, I don't think we'll have anything to celebrate for our birthday in 2017. So the Canadian Canoe Museum is thinking about stuff like putting a canoe in every school as an idea of bringing people together, pulling together, and we're working on that. If you'd like to know more about that, we'd be happy to tell you about that. The Canadian Canoe Museum, with other organizations across the country, is actually looking at bringing youth and other people together to put 150 canoes on every waterway in every provincial and territorial capital. This is a way of looking at the country a little bit differently. We hope to get 1,500 canoes on the water at Victoria Island behind Parliament on that, maybe on Labor Day that time. But the idea of where we are in the country and what we need to do has the imperative and the immediacy of need here, I think, speaks to any complacency that is in your soul. And I've come out of this in a way that just makes me think how lucky we are, but how much we've squandered what we've had, and how little it would take to make the world a better place. So I want to just end with a couple of questions for you. Good night.